Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me in the back? Yes? Okay, excellent. So I just recently started working at Calibrate. Welcome in the Calibrate room. Calibrate has been in business already for 20 years. 20 years, that's longer than jQuery exists. So it's great to see that Drupal companies go for that long. And thanks to Calibrate, I get to start dipping my toes into AI. So we're doing that at Calibrate, and I have the luck to be able to do that with them. Many thanks for that. But here next to me is someone much more knowledgeable than me. It's Dr. Engineer Merlijn Sebrechts. And I have to thank him for coming here in such short notice, because it was a bit short notice from the organization due to practical reasons. And he is a senior researcher at imec and teaches also in the Ghent University. I've been looking at the publications he has, and oh my God, I was like, whoa. So it's really incredible. Very cool to see people that knowledgeable in Belgium. He's also very active in the open source as Ubuntu Community in the Council of Ubuntu, and also working on, and now I have to stretch my tongue, on standardizing WebAssembly System Interfaces for IoT devices with W3C and the Bytecode Alliance. So yeah, really cool stuff that you're working on. He's also knowledgeable about AI and open source in general, and talks about a seismic shift happening, so I'm very curious to hear it. Please give him a warm applause. Welcome to the community, Merlijn.
All right, thank you for the introduction. So, what is required for software to be open source? I see a lot of good submissions here. You need to have a community, you need to have funding, which is important. So open source software cannot remain open source if there is no way to fund the development. There needs to be a lot of transparency. You need governance, you need collaboration. This is also an investment. It's a time investment. This is one of the reasons why we have some diverse issues in open source software, because the amount of free time different people across the world have is very, very different. But one of the most important ones is here, a specific license. Open source requires a specific license. And I'll talk a little bit more about that further in this introduction. But if you read the news, you might think open source AI is currently winning, because you have a lot of really cool headlines, like Meta's new Llama 3 models give open source AI a boost. Wow, cool, Meta, one of the largest companies in the world, is building open source AI and gives it away for free. Or Meta raises the bar with open source Llama 3 large language models. They even in their own documentation, they call their own state-of-the-art open source large language model. Okay, this seems to be incredibly cool. So let's take a look at the license of their AI. So this is the license of their AI. If you go to this URL, this is the license that you have to agree to in order to actually use their open source AI. And so already at the beginning of the license, it says you can only use this software if you adhere to applicable laws. So if there were any open source lawyers in the crowd, you would hear them groaning loudly, because this is something that is almost ridiculous to put into a license. First of all, illegal stuff is illegal. And so you don't have to say that you're not allowed to do illegal stuff, because you're not allowed to do illegal stuff. And then secondly, like applicable laws, well, what laws are you talking about? Like, we happen to live in a very free country with laws that I generally agree with, but that's not the case for a lot of people in a lot of countries. And even if you go through history, like a lot of important progression of our society, of humanity in history has happened by people not necessarily following the laws. Like, since this talk is being recorded, for the record, I have to say, I have never broken any law any time in my life, but I assume that this might not be the case for everyone who is trying to make the world a better place. The second thing, and this is one of the parts of this license that makes me most scared, is that it has an acceptable use policy. If you click through that document, then you read a whole bunch of text about what you are allowed to do with this AI. And so this is basically a document written by a bunch of super rich people in San Francisco, writing about what they think an ideal society should look like. For example, you cannot use Llama if you are a sex worker. There are a lot of very specific groups that are being excluded from being able to use this open source AI. In my opinion, I do not want open source software to be a way to force your own worldview on the rest of the world. And especially not if that worldview is being created by a bunch of very rich people in San Francisco. Then, you cannot use Llama in order to improve other models or in order to train other models. So the only company that can actually use Llama in order to create better AI systems is Facebook or Meta itself. Also, Meta thought they were very, very smart by putting a clause in their license that if the number of users is greater than 700 million monthly active users, then you're not allowed to use this AI. And they thought like, the only companies that have that user base are companies like Google and Amazon, and they're not allowed to use our AI. But like, clauses like these always have unintended consequences. And that's why they are not part of any open source language, any open source license. For example, this cannot be used by the Indian government. Well, fuck India, I guess. But this is apparently open source software. Well, Meta, you keep using the word open source. I don't think it means what you think it means. At least it's not what I think open source should be. In my opinion, open source is about democratizing technology, making technology available to all, regardless of what you use the software for, regardless of where you live, regardless of your political beliefs or your background. Software is available to all. We are building collective knowledge that the next generations will profit from with open source software. This makes it so that we can stand on the shoulders of the giants that came before us. Let's take a quick look at how easy it is today to create applications. Like, if you compare how easy it is to create an app or a website today compared to 50 years ago, it is so much easier. And this is not because suddenly we all became geniuses, we became so much smarter, and this isn't because our IT education became so much better. This is simply because a whole bunch of stuff that programmers had to do 50 years ago, they don't have to do anymore today, because we have this open source giant that we can stand on. Just open your smartphone, take a look at any application on your smartphone. If they are compliant, they will have in their help or info or settings screen somewhere, they will have a submit licenses. And there you will be able to scroll through hundreds and hundreds of different licenses of different open source components that these applications use. Just look at the Facebook app, the Instagram app. Any app is building on top of these giants. And so that's what open source is in my opinion. So in this presentation, I will take a look at why is AI breaking what it means for software to be open source. Who is working to actually solve this issue, to get open source back on its feet, and how are they doing this? But maybe the first question I have to answer, although it is answered a little bit, is who am I? So I'm Merlijn Sebrechts. People who speak English can just call me Merlin. I'm a researcher at imec. I work on software delivery to cloud and edge devices, things like Kubernetes, Terraform. And I also teach at Ghent University. And I'm also an open source developer. I'm part of the Ubuntu Community Council, and currently I'm working with the W3C, building for non-web stuff, using WebAssembly on IoT devices. If you're interested in using WebAssembly on IoT devices, please, after the talk, come talk to me. This talk is about something completely different. So, in order to take a look at why is AI breaking open source, we first need to take a little step back and look at what is open source software exactly, just so we're all on the same page. So, open source, this is very simple. Open source is about sharing the design plans of software, but more specifically, using an open source license. And so a software license is basically the end user license agreement, the source of the single source of the most lies that ever happened in the history of the world. Everybody clicks, yes, I read this license and I accept it. This is a software license. And so you have some paid licenses where in order to use the software you have to pay a price. Some licenses let you use the software for free, and some licenses are open source. But then what is an open source license? Well, the question is actually who determines what is an open source license? And the answer is the Open Source Initiative. It's a non-profit created in 1998 that with the sole purpose basically of defining what open source software is and then creating an ecosystem around that. It defines open source software as software that is under a license that allows a user to run the software for any purpose, see the complete source code of that software, modify the software, and share both the original software and your modifications. Bit of a footnote here, the open source definition is based on the Debian-free software guidelines. And so this definition is actually in some part legally affirmed in court. For example, a court in the US affirmed that it's false advertising to claim software is open source if it's not using an open source license. And so thankfully, the Open Source Initiative is in some way the world leading body that defines what open source software is. And so unsurprisingly, the Open Source Initiative, immediately when Facebook started talking about their Llama model and started saying that it's an open source AI, the Open Source Initiative said Meta's Llama 2 license is simply not open source. But then the problem started, because what does it mean for an AI to be open source? So why is it so difficult to define what an open source AI is? Well, let's take a look at a regular software pipeline. So a regular software pipeline is, first of all, you need a build system. For example, you need a build system that prepares everything for the compiler. Then you need to compile the source code, the resulting binary. You then run the resulting binary on an operating system, and then it often connects to a database or some form of data storage. And so in yellow, I've highlighted which parts of the application need to be open source in order to be able to call the entire application open source. And so first of all, the resulting binary needs to be released under an open source license. The source code needs to be open source. and the build files needs to be open source. This at first seems very logical, but in 1998 this was not necessarily the standard, because there were a lot of discussions, for example, about can you call a piece of software open source if you can only compile it with a closed source compiler, or if you can only run it on a closed source operating system. And back then, after a lot of discussion, they said, okay, so components that are just generally available, like operating systems, like compilers, they do not need to be open source for the application to be open source. Part of this was simple pragmatism, because at that time, there were no production-ready open source compilers available. And so it is very difficult to start a movement if nobody can actually be part of your movement. And so that's why they said, like, look, we need open source compilers, but to get open source compilers, we need an open source movement. And to get open source movement, we need people who can be the creators of the open source software. So they said compilers don't have to be open source, operating systems don't have to be open source, and the same for the data. The data that your application uses, it doesn't have to be open source for your application to be open source. But let's look at a pipeline for building a generative AI. So there's a lot more steps. First of all the steps that I talked about before, you also have them for generative AI, but then you also have additional steps, like first the main training. This is very, very generalized, but the main training, you need input data, you need training code, and you need model code in order to do the initial training of the model. Then you need to do fine-tuning. So you need fine-tuning data, fine-tuning code, and then as a result you have a fine-tuned model. Then you need prompting. You need initial prompts for the model. So which of these components need to be open source in order to be able to call the resulting AI open source? Let's look at the Llama build pipeline, which is more realistic, but still incredibly simplified compared to what it actually is. You see a lot more steps come into it, into building the actual chat, the Llama chat model that you can use. And for Llama 3, it's even more complicated than this. So which of these components needs to be released under an open source license in order to make the AI open source? In order to define that, the open source initiative is currently creating the definition of open source AI. This is a collaborative effort with the entire community to try to figure out what open source AI is. They started this process by describing the problem. Why does the current open source definition not directly apply to AI? And then collect ideas for how can we have a solution for this? What could this definition look like? And they did a whole bunch of podcasts and went to a whole lot of conferences, and I can definitely recommend to just look at these podcasts, listen to the discussion, because it's incredibly interesting. So the open source initiative involved as much people as they could. Basically anyone who can come in contact with an AI is involved in the process of defining what open source AI is. Creators of systems, creators of licenses, regulators, licensees, end users, and even upstream and downstream developers affected by the system or by the system output or interacting with it, even if it's not intentional, their interaction with the system. And so this resulted in a process to draft and review a definition of open source AI. And in October last year, they released the first release candidate of the open source AI definition. So let's take a look at the current version of the open source AI definition. This is draft version 0.0.8. The definition starts out by scoping what the definition claims to be. First of all, the open source AI definition, it doesn't say how to develop and deploy an AI system that is ethical or responsible. This is not about pushing our worldview of what the world should look like onto other people. This is simply a definition of what is open source AI. And you can have ethical open source AI, you can have unethical open source AI, you can have ethical closed source AI, you can have unethical closed source AI. This simply talks about open source, not about ethical use of the AI. So this is the definition. And at first glance, it seems quite logical. So open source AI is a system that grants the freedoms to use the system for any purpose without having to ask for permission, study how the system works and inspect its components, modify the system for any purpose, including to change its output, and share the system for others with or without modifications for any purpose. So yeah, this fits very well into what we all think open source software is. But then the last part is the most interesting part. Preconditions to exercise these freedoms is to have access to the preferred form to make modifications to the system. So in order to be able to study and modify the system, you actually need the source code of the AI, the preferred way to modify the system. But then what is the preferred way? So the definition goes further to explain what is the preferred form. So it's three things. First of all, you need to have an open source description of the training data. Note that this is a description of the training data. The training data itself doesn't have to be open source or open accessible. You need to explain the training methodologies, how you selected data, how you label data, the data origin and its characteristics, how you cleaned the data, and things like that. The second part is that you need the source code that is used, both the source code that is used to train the model and the source code that is used to run the model. Code for pre-processing, training, validation, and testing, tokenizers, hyperparameter search, inference, model architecture. I'm not an expert in how these models work exactly, but apparently these are all words that are very meaningful to people building these models. And then finally, model parameters. So that's what we call the model itself. That's basically the neural network, the thing that defines what the neural network looks like. Both from key intermediate training stages, so for example, we need the pre-trained model and we need the final model in order to have an open source AI. And then also the final optimizer state. So this is basically the draft open source AI definition. But I also included a very useful checklist. Basically, it's a list that goes through all the different parts of an AI and that you can use to check off if all these things are available under either open source definition compliant licenses or OSI approved licenses, then it is an open source AI. Maybe I want to make a quick distinction between an OSI approved license is an open source software license. But AI models also contain a lot of things that are more data than actual software. So there are actually not OSI compliant licenses for data. And so that's why they say an OSD compliant license, like the license needs to comply with the open source definition, but it can be an open data license instead of an open source software license. So then the big question and the big discussion that is happening is, why should we not require the training data sets of an open source AI to be open source too? Well, this is a discussion that is still ongoing, but there seems to be a rough consensus around these 3 points. First of all, similar data is good enough. When you talk to people actually building these models, when they say we need the data, they don't mean we need the specific data that Facebook trained their AI on. That's not what they mean. What they mean is we need data sets that are equal in scale, equal in quality, and so on. the data size, the quality, the language, the type of data, those all matter in order to train an AI that is comparable to OpenAI and to Llama. But what is not required is the identical data, because at such large scales, it doesn't really matter where the data comes from as long as it's high quality. Second of all, there is a lot of legal uncertainty about training data sets. Like, it seems like every day there's a new article coming out about people suing OpenAI and certain lawsuits being won and being lost. And this is all because OpenAI is training their AI on data that they do not have licenses for. They do not have the licenses, they do not have the rights to actually use that data. And so there's a lot of questions about, if you train an AI on data that you do not have the rights for, do you still have the rights on the resulting model? So all these questions make it very difficult to even figure out what does it mean for a training data set to be open source. Companies like OpenAI and like Meta, they are not even able to share the original data set, even if they want to. First of all, for privacy issues. Second of all, due to these licensing issues. And then finally, due to a lack of access of data. Like, a lot of AI training is starting to go towards federated learning, where, for example, your Google keyboard, the Google keyboard, it has this autocomplete features. This Google keyboard trains AI models based on what you type. But what you type never leaves your phone. So there is a model that is constantly being retrained locally on your phone on what you type, and the result, the trained model, is then sent to Google. And so Google themselves never have access to what you type on your smartphone. They have a keylogger, but the keylogger only contains the data locally. And so Google could not even release that data because they don't have that data. And then finally, a final reason is pragmatism. And so this is, again, you cannot start a movement if you have nobody that can join the movement. It is currently impossible to create an open source data set that can be used to train large language models up to the performance that OpenAI or Llama have, even if Meta or OpenAI wanted to do that. Secondly, this is a completely different approach. In order to get this open data, it's a completely different movement, a completely different approach than the open source software movement itself. And it requires legal and policy changes. A lot of the open source data sets that are now becoming available, the main reason why they become available is because either they found legal precedent in order to be able to use that data, or because certain laws are being changed in order to be able to use that data. And I want to add here that this is not a new thing, this kind of thinking, this kind of pragmatic thinking of how can we kickstart this movement, because this is exactly the same with proprietary compilers. Creating open source compilers was a completely different issue from creating open source applications, and that's why an application can be open source even if the compiler itself is not open source. So they are basically following this same precedent. So currently the work on creating this definition is still ongoing, and they're currently in the phase of validation of the definition and the checklist. You can actually get involved if you want to test the definition on open or on AIs that call themselves open or on other AIs. Go to this URL, go to their forum, and there you can find instructions for how to participate. So let's take a short look at the road ahead. Once we have this open source AI definition, there is a lot of work that needs to be done in order to get actual real-world benefits from it. And that's all about compliance, verification, and transparency. In software, transparency, verification, and compliance starts to become a big thing now. Things like a software bill of materials, for example. A software bill of material is becoming incredibly important in order to know the entire supply chain of your software. What are the libraries that are in a certain software version? Where were they compiled? Who had access to this code base? Because in the resulting binary, it's very difficult in a resulting binary to see if there is a vulnerable library version used in that application. Well, with AI models, it's even worse. In AI, the resulting AI model is basically a black box. There is no way to figure out what the actual data was that it was trained on, where it was trained, how it was trained. And so one of the things that we are working on in our research group is on building this AI bill of materials. It's basically a list of ingredients for AI models. Which code was used for the AI? Which training data was used? But also, which training infrastructure? Where was the AI model trained? And can we trust those servers? Can we trust the people who were training the AI? Because they are the ones who are claiming that, yes, this AI was trained on that data. Did you use any adversarial training in order to make the AI more secure? Did you use any adversarial data sets in order to make the AI more secure? When you get an AI model as either a user or a company, you have no idea how secure it is. And like every single company is saying that their AI has been trained with the latest security measures in order to make it really secure. But that, there's no way to verify that. An AI bill of materials makes it possible to verify that. But there are a lot of enabling technologies that have yet to be made and have yet to be connected to an AI bill of materials. Because there are some standard proposals for a simple document, the document format in order to describe all these features. But for the moment, most of these cannot actually be trusted. You are trusting the creator of the AI model. You are trusting that what they say is in the model, that that's actually what is in it. So in order to make this more secure, this needs to be connected to things like trusted computing. So that's basically remote attestation, for example. An external party checks how the model is being trained and then signs the AI bill of materials with their key in order to make it clear, like, look, there's at least 2 companies that have to collude in order for this AI bill of materials to be incorrect. Same with reproducible builds. Reproducible builds is an incredibly difficult and slow-moving effort in order to make it so that when you compile the same software twice, you get the exact same binary, and you can just compare these binaries to verify that the binary actually comes from this source code. We need the same thing for AI, reproducible builds for AI. We also need automatic verification, because there's a lot of legal frameworks that are currently being created in order to safeguard society from AI. Things like the Cyber Resilience Act, things like the AI Act from the European government. And all of these carry a strong compliance burden. So companies have to be able to show that their software, their AI, actually complies with the law. How this used to be done in the past is using consultancy firms. Like the Big Four, Deloitte, PwC, they come to your company, they look at your processes, they look at your code, and then they say, yes, this company actually follows the laws. And companies are, for a lot of laws, companies are required to get consultants in order to show that they comply with software. The European lawmakers are slowly seeing that this is actually an issue, and they should move away from something like this, because this creates a lot of overhead, and this creates an entire industry simply to check if stuff is what it's supposed to be. For the Cyber Resiliency Act, for example, they're looking strongly at using automatic open source verification toolkits that can verify whether or not your software actually complies. And then finally, we need a trust distribution framework, similar to the public key interface. So public key interface, those are SSL certificates. When you surf to facebook.com, your browser already knows which public key it should use to verify whether it's actually talking to facebook.com. This is done using the public key interface. Well, we need something like this for AI models. That when you run an AI, that you can actually verify that this AI is the AI that you think is processing your data and that it complies with these things. So let's get a little bit more concrete. What can you actually do right now? Well, the first thing is break up any conversation and say, actually, Llama is not open source. The reason why there is legal precedent for open source being connected to the open source definition is because a very, very large part of our ecosystem, a very large part of the programmers know that open source means a very specific thing. And as a result, judges, when they judge on court cases of companies saying something is open source and it's not actually open source, judges see like, oh yeah, consumers actually expect open source to be this very specific thing. So if you constantly keep saying, look, open source, that is a very specific definition of defined by the open source initiative. Llama is not open source because the open source initiative says that it's not using an open source license. If you want to do open source AI, you need to follow the OSI definition. The more people say this, the more people correct other people, the more people complain about Meta's deceptive behavior around their AI, the better the ecosystem is and the more power we have in order to actually force companies to do open source for real instead of simply saying something is open source. And then secondly, get involved. If you want to help define the open source definition, well, go to opensource.org/deepdive and join the conversation. We can use a lot of voices in this discussion. Secondly, create open source data sets. This is a complete separate effort, but also incredibly important in order to get the beneficial effects of open source AI. And then finally, build and improve open source AI. So, thank you for your attention. If there are any questions, I can throw around this mic. I also put my email address here for if you want to send me an email, and this URL is the place to go to if you want to learn more about open source AI.
First of all, thank you. That was really insightful talk and really great to have at a conference like this. My question is about economic side. So the last thing that you have mentioned is build your own open data sets. So they claim that training the ChatGPT 3.5 costed to Microsoft something around $1 billion. So how we can, as an open society, open source community, can afford things like this?
It's a very good question. So I want to connect to a few points in my presentation. So the first one is that the open source definition, it also requires intermediately trained models to also be available. This means that, for example, the very, very expensive initial training of the Llama model doesn't have to be repeated in order to change the model. Because you can simply start from the initial model and then fine-tune it with a lot less expensive training, fine-tune it and change it a little bit. Then secondly, in open source, basically, open source often has this long tail scenario of like, you have a few incredibly big players who are doing closed source software, but they're like 3 or 4 companies. And then the rest of the ecosystem are all collaborating on open source. And so one of the ways to solve this issue of very expensive training is just to gather all these resources. There are way more companies building open source AI systems and continuing on open source AI systems than the few gigantic multinationals in the US that are building closed source AI systems. And so even though individual companies don't have the resources available to them, they can pool resources in order to actually train and build these systems. And then you could go to efforts like what we had with protein folding, for example, where individuals can actually donate some of the spare compute power of their laptops, for example, or of their gaming PCs, in order to help train these open source models. Okay, if there's no more questions, then thank you for your attention, and feel free to come talk to me.